I would think it started when I was with a good friend of mine. We were growing up together and we were maybe 12 or 13 years old. And he was telling me just some stories of things that had happened in his family. He was sharing those stories over the years. For the one he was talking about, his mother who had been very ill and she was in the hospital, and then he just sort of started off with, well, did I tell you that my mother died while she was on the operating table? Now, these stories are fairly common today, but we're looking at 50 years ago, and those stories were not common. But I mean, we were good friends, and he was sort of sharing with me, and I said, no, I didn't realize that. But I said, she didn't die. He said, no, she came back. And I said, well, tell me what happened. She was having a lot of problems. She had all sorts of medical issues, and her body was not in good shape. She was in the hospital, something had happened, and she had flatlined. And then she told her son that it was the typical, I was looking down on myself. I could hear everything the doctors were saying, and at a certain point she sort of felt drawn to look behind her, and she saw this light, and she started heading towards the light. And suddenly she felt like she was ripped away from this feeling of satisfaction and anticipation, that feeling of, well, I'm finally free of that body of clay, I can move around, I don't feel any pain. And then she was back in the body. They said the first thing she said to the doctors was, why did you bring me back? I was in a good place. So it was that kind of kicked it off to think, well, maybe there's something here. He told me one time of how he had married a woman who had some heart difficulties. At one point, his sister was on a honeymoon overseas with her husband. They were on the honeymoon. Her sister gave him a phone call. She said, what's happening to your wife? And he said, well, yeah, you know how she is. No, she said, something bad has happened to your wife. I can feel it. And he said, well, okay, she's had a heart thing and she's in the hospital and they're operating on her heart. And the sister, who was thousands of miles away, and she just seemed somehow to know about that. So there's sort of strange things that happened in that family. His wife did at one point pass away. They had a baby daughter who was very young at the time. And my friend had made a gravestone, often took the child to the gravestone so that the gravestone would be meaningful. He had the image of his wife carved onto the gravestone, and it was a pretty remarkable image, sort of like photo sketched in acid and things like this. He's quite talented and artistic, and he would take his little daughter there often enough so that she would know who her mother was. He was in a park one day and he was feeling particularly sad. It was a park that he had often gone to with his wife. He said his daughter was just playing, I think he said it was a sandbox or something. And he said he was just sort of moping and feeling really sad. Then his daughter suddenly said, well, Daddy, don't be sad. Look, Mommy's here. And he looked at his daughter, and she was pointing to something in the midair. And his daughter said, see, Mommy says, don't be sad. Don't be sad. She doesn't want you to be sad. Did you want to talk to Mommy? And he said he just could feel the skin prickling and the hair going up, and he was just too shocked to say anything. And he was just starting to think what to say. And then the daughter turned back to him and she said, oh, Mommy said she has to say goodbye now. She's gone. Which was sort of in line with that family kind of weird stories. And then years later, when that daughter was still young, I get the impression maybe 6 or 7 years old, there was an embankment at a shopping mall, and he was standing and he was talking to somebody, and she had wandered off and she had started climbing up this embankment, which is by a roadway, and it was a hill, and she was climbing up holding on to the railing, and he'd sort of seen it, but he was engaged in conversation. And he said suddenly it was as if he was whipped around and somebody was rushing him at full speed. He said, suddenly I was running full speed. I had no idea what was happening. And he said, I was heading straight for that wall. And he said, just as I was about to crash and was putting out my arms, I heard a scream. I looked up, my daughter slipped and was falling down. And he said, I was right there and I caught her in my arms. I said, I can't explain it. I had no idea what was happening or why I was running or what was going on, but I was there and I caught my daughter. So stories of that sort got me interested in things of the paranormal. He told it in such a way that it seemed very truthful and very sincere. And we had joked around about different things, but we had never joked around about that sort of thing. And that sort of got me into looking at those kind of stories and watching for those kind of stories. I think one of the earliest stories that really caught my attention was one that became very, very famous in news articles and otherwhere around the world, was the story of Houdini. They said Houdini had been very, very close to his mother. I don't know what his father was in the picture or not at all, but his mother passed away. He was just heartbroken, but he kept on with the show. And his show grew in popularity and more people came to see him. So he had practiced sitting in tubs full of ice cubes and things like this. And of course he was an expert at expanding and retracting his body to slip out of chains and straitjackets and such. But he thought his big show would be to carve a hole into the ice-covered Hudson River, have his manservant, who was apparently a big burly guy that could lift him up with chains and everything, and have this guy come and pick him up and drop him through a hole in the ice, chained and in a suit in the freezing cold water, while the reporters were standing on the ice taking all these shots and doing everything. And that's fine. And 10 minutes went by, and 15 minutes went by, and 20 minutes, 30 minutes. The reporters were all packing up. They said, there's no way even the great Houdini can possibly be alive after that. The manservant just sort of, he had seen Houdini do some remarkable things, and he couldn't believe Houdini was dead, so he just stayed there. And then at one point, all of a sudden Houdini's head pops up, and he has to have assistance to climb out of the hole. And all these newspaper reporters that got in and started their newspapers, the great Houdini is dead, dropped in the ice, never seen again, we waited 20 minutes not to reappear. Houdini says what had happened is he had dropped down the hole, and because he had so well conditioned his body to icy conditions, the cold wasn't problematic for him. And because he was an expert at getting out of straitjackets and chains, that wasn't a problem either. But he hadn't counted on the fact that just because ice doesn't move, it just sort of sits there as a solid, the water underneath is still flowing. And so by the time he got everything off and started coming up to the surface, he couldn't see the hole. He didn't know where the hole was, and he could feel the current sweeping him out towards the ocean. He was tremendously physically capable, from what I understand. So he came back up, and he noticed that the surface of the ice underneath is sort of wavy, and there were pockets of air. So he started to climb against the current, breathing every now and then in these pockets of air underneath the ice, crawling his way forward, hoping he was, but the Hudson River where they dropped him in was quite wide. And currents move and bounce around and such, so he had no idea really. He said his force was failing him. He was starting to feel that's it. He just can't carry on. This is the moment that he's going to die. And then he said he heard his mother's voice calling him. Come towards my voice. And that spark of adrenaline, he started to push himself once more, and he crawled towards where that ice was, seemed to be calling to him, and suddenly there was this little hole. And that's when he popped his head out, and his man guy was there to help pull him out. The newspaper reporters, of course, when they heard that Houdini was still alive, they had to change it, but then it was an even bigger story. Houdini comes back from the dead listening to the voice of his mother, and they said that Houdini swore that if his mother could reach to him from the other side, he would reach to her from this side. they say for years, for decades, on the anniversary of, I forget if it was when he went in the hole of her death or something, he tried to contact her every way he knew how. He had already proven many, many times over that these people that did seances and such, they were all fakes, because he knew all the tricks, and he would expose them to the point where if they knew he was coming, these seance artists would disappear until he left town. But it didn't stop him from trying. They were saying that at the time when he was dying, he said, "My greatest trick yet will be to escape from the other side and let people on this side know what there is there." Nobody's heard of him since, though. He's passed away. And that, I thought, then I started looking for stories like that were in journals and such, and I started hunting around, and I found one about Stanley, who was the newspaper reporter that went into deepest, darkest Africa to discover Livingston. And when he got there, he said, "Dr. Livingston, I presume." And it was a story we all learned about as school children, how this hard-nosed, tough guy, news reporter from somewhere in New York, was given an assignment to see if he couldn't find Dr. Livingston, because everybody presumed he was dead, but they had no proof. So he had set off, and he had gone to Africa, and he had gone through all sorts of difficulties, and he did, in fact, find Livingston. The story I read was how he was back in New York with his journalist buddies. They were playing cards, drinking hard, playing hard, and he was holding his cards. And then all of a sudden the room seemed to go dark. And when the light sort of came back on, he was in his grandmother's room. And his grandmother turned and looked at him and smiled and passed away. And then suddenly he was back. The guys were kind of pushing at his shoulder. "Well, come on, it's your turn to play the cards." They say Stanley flipped his cards down. He said, "I got something more important to do." And he went back and he wrote down everything he could remember. As a newspaper reporter, they said he had an unusually good memory, almost photographic. And he wrote down all these details of everything that was in the room and everything that was going on. The thing that was remarkable was Stanley was in America. His grandmother was in England. He telegraphed some cousins who were in England. They said, "Yes, we were there when Grandma died." And he said, "Was so-and-so wearing such and such? Did so-and-so they say this? Was this in the room? Was that in the room? Did Grandma say this just before she passed away? Did she do..." All these details that he had written down right away before he forget them. And the friend said, "Come on, this is a joke. How can you possibly know all this? It's all true, but there's no way you can know it." And Stanley just said, "I think for a moment I was there." And then later on he wrote about it, and it was a documented story that I had read, and I forget what article or what place it was that I had seen it in particular. So stories like that were I found interesting. There are strange things. I mean, you had the story of I think it was in maybe National Geographic, of this guy who was looking. He had heard that there were strange creatures living in deepest, darkest Congo, so to speak, and he was there, and he had a film crew, but the humidity was so thick it was like breathing water, and nobody could stand it. The bugs were horrific, and they were just going, so the film crew packed up all their stuff on the boat, and they're just leaving. Then he saw some trees starting to sway while he was out in the back having a smoke, because of course cigarette smoke keeps away some of the bugs. And he said he saw something that he could only say was a dinosaur. He said it sort of looked like what they had then called a brontosaurus. Now they say brontosaurus. That was a mistake in an identity. It was a mix-up of two. But he said something like that, huge, moving through the dusk. He said, but I couldn't record it. He said it was exactly the thing we're looking for, but everybody had put it away. And he said, "No, all you have is my word that I saw it, but I can't prove anything." But his story did make it to this national magazine. There was another one that I remember reading about a runner, and I forget how old he turned, 50 or 60. He decided that he would make it very, very special for himself. He was a marathon runner, that he would fly to the Himalayas and he would run the trails of the Himalayan mountains, and that would be to celebrate this sort of landmark year. When he came back, he said, I think I saw a Sasquatch. And they went in, they reported, and apparently in the interviews they said, well, we want to know exactly where it is, we're going to take films, we're going to get the tracks, we're going to prove it. And he says, no. I let you know that they're still there, but I'm not going to give you any of those details. And they said, well, we can't authenticate it. Why are you being stubborn? They said, I know exactly what's going to happen. The story's going to get out, everything's going to go there, and you're going to have people that are going to try to shoot this thing so they can mount it and put it up. And he said, it's a thing of legend, who knows? But he said, I am pretty sure. He said, I was running below and a rock rolled past me from up above. I looked up and I just saw this huge thing looking down at me, and he said it was just sort of the classical Sasquatch story. But again, it's a story that just remains in high circles, and we report it to this scientific society and such. And there are those people, of course, that will claim, well, it's probably just a fake, it's just an attention-getting sort of thing. But it just sounded, the voice and the tone of the person that wrote the article it just seems so sincere and so convinced that, yeah, this probably did happen. It's too bad we don't have the proof, but maybe it's better that we don't. So you have stories like that where you have to wonder about how true is this. People do like to embellish a good story, so it does make you wonder. But there are other stories that I've heard people that I had worked with that had interesting experiences. One person, she shared with me, oh, you've got a turquoise aura. And I said, a turquoise aura? And she said, yeah. She said, just for a moment I saw it around you. We were good friends, and we had talked on occasion, and so we started talking about that. And she said, yeah. She said, I don't know why. I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse, but I can see things or feel things. Sometimes a complete stranger can walk in and I can sort of feel, for a moment, I can sort of feel this aura around the person, and it sort of says things to me about that person. But she says, I don't know why. And I said, well, has any of this stuff sort of proven true? And she said, well, not directly, but she said, I do have this ability to sort of know things. And she said, I had a girlfriend that came up to me and she was pregnant. And I asked her the usual, oh, can I just put my hand on your belly for a moment? She said, sure. And my friend said, oh, you're going to have, I think she said a girl. And her friend said, oh, no, we've had an ultrasound. I've just come back from the ultrasound. It's a boy. My friend looked at her and she said, ultrasounds can be wrong. It's a girl. And her friend said, this is pretty high medical technology here. The doctor says it's a boy, or, it's a boy. But when the baby was born, it was exactly what this woman had said it would be. Said she doesn't share these stories, but enough of these sort of things have happened that her families know, and they just call her the witch in a friendly, loving way. And I said, well, how many other people know about that? And she said, I don't share this story. She says, this is not something you share with other people. There was one of the other guys that we were with. He had sort of caught the tail end of that story. And he said, strange things happen. He said, one time I was at my father's deathbed. He said, my father and I had butted heads all our life. We were just so much alike, it just didn't work for us. And I left as soon as I could. But I heard he was dying. He was in the hospital dying. So I thought, well, I should make my peace with him now anyways. He went to the hospital. He saw the tremendous pain that his father was in. And he said, I just couldn't hardly stand to look at him like that. And he said, I said a prayer. He said, oh God, if only I could carry that pain and ease his pain for a moment. And he said, then I felt this jolt. And he said, it was nerve numbing. I was ready to throw up. I was feeling so hurt and so in pain. And he said, I looked at my father, and my father's face was all calm and relaxed. And he said, I tried to hang on to it as long as I could. Then I finally said, I can't, take it back, I can't stand it. He said, suddenly his father arched his back and died. The man said, I felt guilty ever since. He said, I don't know if I helped or hindered. He said, it was so weird and so spooky. And he said to the other friend, he said, if I hadn't heard that little bit about what your friends and you're like this whole witch thing, He said, it's not a story I share. He said, I don't understand it, and I feel badly about it. But he said, I feel safe because you know where I'm coming from. And she said, yeah, I know what you're saying. It's not the kind of thing that you would share with everybody because you don't want them to think that there's something wrong with you. So I kept an ear open for other stories. We had a camp at the school where I was teaching. We used to take the children there. And it was evening time and a campfire. I didn't want the kids wandering too far from the cabins. So I was sort of telling ghost stories, tried to make them a little bit spooky, just keep them in their place. So we put the kids into their separate cabins. And then this teacher I was with said, those stories may be a little more true than you realize. I said, well, these are just stories. I said, they might be based on truth, but I'm sure they're quite exaggerated. And she said, well, let you tell, you think this one through yourself. She said that when she was in teacher's college, she shared a dorm room with another teacher. My friend was very hardworking from the get-go, just exceptionally, and she was working away, getting her lesson plans ready that she had to teach in front of. As a student teacher, you get marked on it, and she always wanted to do a good job. And her friend was ironing some clothes on the other side. All of a sudden, there's this bang and this clatter, and I guess the ironing board had fallen over, and her friend said, "Did you see that? Did you hear that?" And my friend sort of, "What are you doing? I'm trying to get this done. I have to present tomorrow." She said, "No, didn't you see that? Didn't you hear that?" My friend said, "See or hear what?" Knocking over the iron. She said, no. She said, just a moment ago, my grandmother was in the corner. And she said, I've come by to say goodbye and to let you know how much I love you. And she said, I just, and then she was gone. And she said that, and then everything fell down. But she said, my friend said, look, I know that your grandmother's in the hospital. I know she's dying. I know that the two of you are very close. I know she's on your mind. But and then the phone rang. It was this girl's mother. And she said, I know how close you were to your grandmother. I just wanted you to know that just before she passed away, just a few minutes ago, she said your name. I just thought I wanted you to know that. My friend, who very logical and very practical and very no nonsense, said that story has stuck with her because she was just about to tell her friend and her dorm buddy just how silly it was to believe in these things. And she said, well, now I don't know. And she said that when she was taking courses in university, because of that thing that happened to her as a student teacher, and she was taking courses in university years later, she took a credit with a guy who said that he was an official ghostbuster. And he was giving university credits based on his information and his teaching and all the stuff that he had done. So she went there, and she came back with all sorts of stories. I'm sorry, I can't remember most of them. But there was the one where it was a hotel, and they said that certain nights they couldn't rent the room because there was a scream and this like somebody running through the room and jumping off the balcony, to the point where this Ghostbuster professor was called to come over. So he set up his stuff and he was waiting at the appointed time and place, and he saw this image of this guy all frantic, and he stopped him. He said, wait, before you go, I see you. I recognize you and I have to know what has happened, what's going on. And I don't remember the story clearly, but something about coming with an engagement ring to ask this girl to marry him, and he came in and found her with somebody else, and the shock was just so great, he just screamed and ran and flipped off the balcony and died. And so this professional professor said, do you know that you're dead? Do you know that this is over? Do you know this huge, intense, emotional experience? That happened years ago, but it's not happening now. You can go. He said, just look over your shoulder. What do you see? apparently the ghost said, well, I see a light. He said, just walk towards the light and just keep on walking. You'll be fine. You don't have to stay here. And after that, apparently the hauntings of that particular room were finished. Then there was another story about going to a building where there seemed to be somebody down in the old laundry room. Seemed to be a woman, and she seemed to be scrubbing on a washboard, an old washboard. Kind of had I saw my grandmother using them. They were sort of rippled glass, and she was scrubbing and scrubbing and scrubbing away. And people would go down. Occasionally, they would see this woman scrubbing, and so he went there, and he asked her the story for herself. And she said, well, it's all my fault. My children are dead. It's all my fault. They got this disease, and I know it must be in their clothing, and I'm scrubbing their clothing. It's my fault. I've got to clean these clothes. I've got to clean these clothes. So he researched, and he found out that there had been an epidemic of some kind, scarlet fever, polio, smallpox. I can't recall what it was. But her children, one after another, it had gone through the household, and she had lost her children. And she had blamed herself for not perhaps cleaning the clothes well enough, that how could it be spreading? This was happening. She was the one responsible. She was responsible for their health and welfare and their safety. They died on her watch. She wasn't going to. So he met with her again, and he explained to her, you know, your children died a long, long time ago. They're not here. If you want to be with your children, this is what you do. Look over your shoulder. Do you see the light? And walk toward it. And that haunting stopped. So the stories that she had told from this professional, they all seemed like there was nothing about a malevolent spirit or something trying to kill other people, though you do hear stories. And my friend who had all those interesting incidences with his wife and with his sister phoning him and such, said that, oh, this would be maybe 7 or 8 years ago only, they were up. He was thinking to remarry. And he was with this lady, and they bought this really old dump of a place, a real fixer-upper that nobody else would buy. I said, well, I'm very handy. My wife-to-be is very handy. We'll fix this place up. We'll sell it. And he would come home in the evening from work, and she would say, oh, there's somebody else in this house, and they don't want me here. And he sort of said, well, you know, can you tell me about it? And things would just happen in the house. And she said, I'm scared. I don't really want to stay here. I said, then one night he woke up, and he could feel like something was around his throat. And he opened his eyes, and he said he wasn't sure if he was awake or not, but he could see this person glaring at him. And then he started to move, and this person glared at him, glared at his fiancée, and then just disappeared. And so he said to his fiancée, you know what? This place is haunted. I could feel a desire to get us out of here. Whoever or whatever it is doesn't want us. So they really worked hard, fixed the place up, sold it, and moved away, and I haven't heard anything since that time. So despite the stories of the professional Ghostbuster guy, it seems there might be some people that are stuck. And his impression was these people have had an experience so traumatic that they can't leave. They're stuck in that moment, and they keep replaying it and replaying it and replaying it until somehow somebody can set them free and let them know they're dead, because he said they don't know. They're just reliving that moment, that fearsome passion of whatever happened in that moment just can't leave them till they're redirected. On the other hand, I did hear of a story of another woman, and you're right when you suggested people don't really want to talk about these things, but sometimes in the right time, in the right places. And I worked at the school that I was at. I worked there for over 20 years. You get to meet people and know them, and there's sometimes quiet time. And if you're sort of interested in that sort of thing and kind of follow up little leads or hints of things that they've said. She said that that her son seemed to have some kind of ability to see things or see people that she couldn't. And she couldn't really say that he wasn't. She didn't see anything, but he was just so convinced, and he talked about it so naturally that she felt, well, there might be something here. She had moved away, and then she had come back to the area, and they had been out of the area for a while, and they were kind of desperate. She wanted to get back to work, actually to go return back to the school where she had been teaching before and where I had first seen her. And she said that they got this place that was a good price, and they had moved in, but again, it was sort of little things that would happen that they couldn't explain, particularly when they were doing something in the kitchen and they were reorganizing the kitchen. In the middle of the night, they heard all this banging and movement, went over to take a look around, and somebody had pulled out the drawers and dumped all the cutlery and stuff on the floor. So then these things went on, and then she talked to her son about it, and he said, oh yeah, that's, and I forget the name of the guy, but he said, yeah, that's so-and-so, and he said, this is his house, he died here, and he just likes keeping things the way they are, and he doesn't like it when people move things around. And apparently there were some other episodes. The one wall and it was really needed to be fixed up, and so she thought she'd repaint it, and all of a sudden they hear a can of paint getting knocked over, and they run out to look in the hallway, and a can of paint that they had been using the paint, and they were taking a break, and somebody had kicked over that can of paint, and the paint was all over there. And then the son came back in a few minutes. He says, yeah, he says he does not like that color. He says, and I forget what color. So she said she constantly was checking in with her son. Well, ask him if we can do this, or ask him if he would do that. And apparently, she said that if they would ask him, and her son would come back with an opinion, then these things stop happening. And she said after a while, they stopped completely. And her son said, yeah, he thinks we're okay, and he likes the changes we made. He's okay with that. And she said, and everything just sort of stopped. So you do hear those kind of stories. And there was another woman who said that she had a sort of a mixed parentage, but part of her parentage was gypsy. When her father passed away, her father was of gypsy line and gypsy lineage. They had a wake in honor of her father. And she said she's not too much into weird kind of things, but she said what happened there was rather interesting. They had set it up in their typical fashion with everything for drinks. Everybody was drinking, everybody was eating, everybody was feasting. People are coming up and telling stories about the deceased. Said all around the room there were all these candles, and all across the room, across the entire room, the whole perimeter was with these candles. And then at one point one of the gentlemen stood up and he said, okay, that's it. He's just about to leave. Anybody else have anything else left to say? Then you can just say goodbye now, because he's about to go. And there was a moment of people sort of looking at each other, and she said, all the candles were suddenly snuffed out. She said, just like everything was just snuffed out. And she said it was the weirdest, strangest experience. She said the other side of her background would say all this gypsy nonsense. It's just nonsense. But she said, I was there and I saw it. And she said, I don't know how they could have pulled it off if it was a trick, but she said, I was convinced that there's something more there than we can understand here. There's other stories too. I had referenced back to ancient stories. I had talked about, possibly Sasquatch and possibly dinosaurs, but just recently I had read a story about a gentleman who was, well, I don't know how old he was. I sort of got the impression he and his buddies were sort of a little bit on the rowdy side. So he and his fishing buddies had decided to go on a canoe trip to see if they could get some really good fishing on some backwater river way, way up north. They got there and they were poking around and they were on the water, fishing here, fishing there. Luck wasn't very good. And finally they had to get out and do a portage because there was a huge waterfalls. They got to the bottom of the waterfalls and they said, wow, waterfalls, it's usually a good place to fish. We could do really well here. And so they got all their gear set up and they lined up their canoes. They're going to go out the next day, and meanwhile they're hollering and hooting and having, I guess they had probably brought alcohol or something with them. But an older gentleman came down. He looked native and he said, you know, these are sacred waters to my people. There are spirits here. You're disturbing them. Please treat this place with respect. And you can stay, but you all this yelling and shouting, you have to stop that. And it sounded as if he and his buddies were a little less than polite with this older gentleman. And so he said, well, I've warned you. And then this gentleman left. The guys got up early the next morning to go, and they went to their canoes, and I don't know if you do any fishing, but you can sort of let the line loose. And their line and their lures were woven through the trees, all throughout, so they couldn't reel their stuff in because it was all mixed in and cut down. So they actually had to cut their fishing lines and save what they could. And they said it was just so spooky, the fact they had this warning, and then to wake up they said, could it be raccoons? Well, no, look at some of these branches. Well, could it be squirrels? Could squirrels possibly do that? I mean, all our fishing gear, all our lines are up in the trees like this. And he said, you know what? I think we really messed up. Let's just take what we've got and leave this place now, and we'll try our luck further down. But had been so impressed with what had happened as something more than they would naturally credit, that they actually wrote into the fishing magazine and they named the places, they named the spot, and they said, you know, if you ever go to that spot, don't make the mistake we did. You'll regret it. And we're only sorry we didn't listen to the gentleman. So there's stories up and about like that too. But then you hear other stories. I know that among the native people there are stories that strangely echo some of the things that you hear in Europe. There was a CBC special at one point where they were talking about St. Patrick's Day, and they spoke with a gentleman who said, oh yes, I grew up with the stories of the leprechauns. And I said, well, you don't really believe those stories. You were just a kid. And he says, no, he says, I believe the stories. There are these wee people. They're there. We don't really notice them or see them, but our traditions are deep and they're strong, and those little people are there, and you don't mess with them. And the interviewer said, well, do you have any examples, any stories you can share? I said, oh yeah. He said, well, there's a big marsh. My family, we lived on one side, but there was this really nice girl lived on the other side of the marsh. And he said there were ways to get through the marsh. There were sort of like stepping stones you could go across and over. But my father always said, that marsh is where the wee people live. You don't go there in the evening. That's their time. They don't want us big folk out. Don't ever go there. You got to promise me you'll never go through that marsh at night. I said, sure. Well, he was out with his girl, and one thing led to another, and it was getting late, and it started to get dark. And he suddenly realized that for him to go all the way around the marsh and back, he'd never make his curfew. But he figured, I've been over those stepping stones so often, I know them by heart, and there's just enough light I can get through. So he said goodbye to his girlfriend, and he said, I started running across there. And he said, all of a sudden, I was getting jabbed in around my ankles and my heels, and I just dove all over my feet. He said, something was piercing right through. He said, I ran as fast as I could. And he said, at that moment, I realized that I should have listened to my father. They're here, and they're mad at me. And he got home, and he got there, and as soon as he could, he put his feet in cold water, and then his father came around. He said, you're in kind of late. Why are you soaking your feet? Was it the little people? And son was ashamed, but he said, yeah, they got me. And he lifted up his feet, and he said, everything from just above my ankle all the way down was all covered with these jab marks. He said something there was jabbing at me and stabbing at me. And he said, I've been over that trail many times during the day. And he said, I know now. They're in there. And what my dad said was true. You don't go through there once the sun is going down. So it was interesting to me when I was taking courses on native studies that the natives of America have their stories of little people with strange, what we would call strange magical kind of powers, sort of the power to create illusions and all sorts of interesting things. But and I don't have too many details on that. I can't remember those stories too well, except what had struck me was after hearing that story about the man in Ireland who firmly believes, as an adult, in the leprechauns, to hear that the natives have all these legends about these little people as well. Because it's not something you usually hear about, but it was in a book written by native people as stories of our people. So there was interesting things. I think one of the other interesting stories was I had read an anthology of stories from and by and for native people, and it was about something that we would call a Wendigo. They said that it was in the annals of the Hudson Bay Company, in the company journals, that they had come across a story about an outpost that was somewhere, I think it was Lake Winnipegosis or something, and there was a river that goes in there, and the Hudson Bay Company had built a fort there because then they could trade with the native people who were coming across the lake, and they could also trade with those coming down the river. And that they had had an incident where the person in charge of the Hudson Bay Fort had to go and investigate something on behalf of, the government, so to speak. But they say the story was that one of the native people had gone missing, and they said that according to their legends, if you stay out too long under the northern lights, at least I think it was it was some kind of a Cree group, I think, then your soul can get frozen and you take up the spirit of the Wendigo, and you develop like a superhuman strength and this bloodlust. And that there was a Wendigo out there, and that the chief had decided for his people that they would have to go and they would have to capture this Wendigo, and the only way to deal with it would be to burn it, because the spirit had been frozen inside. It had to be burned, and that's how you would purge the Wendigo spirit from the spirit of the person. That nobody had wanted to go. He tried to get some of his bravest warriors to go out, but the stories of the Wendigo, the legends were deep, and the people had a horror of the Wendigos. But apparently in that village there was a guy who was half white and half native. He was rejected by the white people because I guess they were part of his ancestry. They were English, and they just, there's upper caste, lower caste, and natives were definitely not upper caste. And for the natives, they were resentful of what the white people were doing, and because he was part white, there was sort of a resentment of him. But they say he was a big, huge man, young and strong, but very, very lonely, because he just felt shunned by everybody. So he said, look, if nobody else is going to do it, I'll do it. He said, I will go help. And then the medicine man said, well, then you're going to need me too. So he said, let's get the biggest toboggan that we've got, the strongest ropes we can find in the village, and we get to get the biggest and strongest huskies that we can to pull the toboggan. So they went out. They went to the cabin where there had been the hunter who had gone missing, and the cabin, all they had found was the shorn and shredded remains of the wife and the children of this guy. The medicine man said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to pull this cabin apart, and we're going to make a fire. We're going to burn the bodies, and the smell of burning flesh, that should bring the Wendigo to us. This man should be coming back. So they did that. So later on, when the factor from the Hudson Bay Company was cross-examining, and I guess you could speak this part native, part white person. He was saying, yeah, we were burning it down and the smoke was rising. He said, we were far away. It was a hunting camp. And he said, all of a sudden, the dogs became very quiet and started to whine. And he said, then I became aware of something approaching us from the other side of the fire. And he said, it just didn't look human. It was like the face was all crusted, and it was as if this thing had been chewing at its own fingers, at its own lips. And it was just staring at us. He said it was horrible. He said, the medicine man said, don't move. He said, just watch. And he said, when I tell you to, you take these heavy ropes, you grab them, and you bind them down to the toboggan. And said, that's how we're going to take them back. And at a certain point, this Wendigo leaped across the fire right on the medicine man and started to claw at him. And the medicine man was chanting and saying things and doing things, and then the Wendigo suddenly stopped for a moment. The medicine man told the other guy, he says, okay, now grab him, put him on the toboggan, tie him down as tightly as you can. Which he did. He said, I did that. And we had the dogs hooked up, and then we had to force the dogs. And we told this toboggan, and he said this thing was yelling and screeching and screaming. And he said, I didn't know if the ropes were going to burst or if its body was going to burst apart. And it was so strong, it was rocking the toboggan back and forth. And it was all I could do to keep up with the dogs. And the medicine man was saying something to keep the dogs going. And he said, we got to the village. By the time we got to the village, the chief and the others had put together this sort of totem and had all the wood there. And he said, we just grabbed this toboggan and we put it up and we lashed more ropes around. We put all the wood around it and we burnt this thing. And the yelling and the screaming and the uproar had been so loud that they had heard it in the fort. And then people had come rushing over, and some people had gone back to the factory of the fort and said, they're burning a man alive. They've got him on the stake and they're burning him alive. So they're burning this person alive, and of course when the factor comes over, there's the proof is right there because they've got everything up. And he feels obliged to carry out an investigation. There's fear that who would they burn? Well, it must have been a white guy maybe. So he had to get all the details. And he had interviewed different people. And this person that was part white and part native was one of the people that he interviewed. And the story that he gave and the details that the factor could put together were found, apparently if you look, that you can still find them in the journals of the Hudson Bay Company from that particular post. So I found that sort of an interesting story. What it made me think of, though, because years later I read about one person who was a native. He said that a lot of young natives were involved in the First World War for Canada, and possibly the Second World War. Not so much because they wanted to do it for Canadians, but because they were warriors and they had a warrior tradition, and part of being a warrior was to go out and fight. And so a lot of them joined. But the one in the trenches of World War I noticed that one of his native buddies was gone. And then something happened. He was out crawling around in the trenches and he saw his buddy. And even though a lot of the people in the trenches were starving, his buddy looked quite well fed. And it was, he said, in our tradition, people that eat the bodies of others, eat the bodies of the dead or others, those are the Wendigo. And he said, in our tradition, we cannot let the Wendigo live. And he said, and he just said, I ended up killing him. And he said, I know for the white people, that's murder. And he said, for us, that's a Wendigo. And there's only one thing you can do with a Wendigo: destroy it. So there's stories up and about, and it makes you wonder how all these things are intertwined, how many things get embellished. And I know that my story wouldn't be totally accurate because over the years, memory works little tricks on you too. In terms of the Quebec legends, when we were studying it because of my background as a French teacher, I found them rather interesting. They had spoken with people about the stories of the the loup-garou, which we would call a werewolf, and the feu follet, which we would call a jack-o'-lantern. And they had interviewed, again, I think it was the CBC, to get different stories of the French culture, French-Canadian culture. And the guy said, yeah, French Canada at the time was very strongly Catholic, and they had some stern warnings about interacting with the devil and interacting with strangers and going out when you shouldn't go out. And they said that if a person wouldn't go to confess their sins to the church, which is a very strong Catholic, I think it's still some strong Catholic, but then your soul entered a stage where you would become a loup-garou. And at night, you will go out and about, and then your body would just transform into an animal. It wasn't necessarily a wolf. It could be a horse, it could be a pig, could be a dog, could be anything. But your spirit was reverting to sort of an animal form. And you could tell, because if you shone a light in the eyes of the animal, there would be this pink glare coming back at you. And that he said that when he was growing up as a child, he said that certainly kept everybody in line. There was no question in any of the children's minds that the loup-garou was a real phenomenon. He said, but if you didn't go to confession for 14 years, your soul had gone evil, and at night when you were sleeping, the evil in your soul would leave through your mouth as a ball of light, and it would go out to do whatever mean mischief it could do, even causing death of people. And one of the favorites would be, it would see somebody going out at night, walking maybe late in the evening or whatever, and it would hide in the bushes and mimic the name of somebody that the person walking around knew. And of course, in rural Quebec, the towns were very small, the villages, you'd know everybody, but this voice could mimic perfectly. And it might be somebody saying, it's me, it's your mother, I'm stuck, you've got to come help me. I don't know how I got in this situation. I just went out for a few minutes, I tripped and fell and I rolled down the hill, I'm over here, you've got to help me. And stories of how then the person would wander off to follow this voice, and the feu follet, this evil energy, would just float through the forest till it was hanging just past the edge of a steep cliff, and would call, and the person would, I can see you, come closer, I'm right here. And the person going towards it then wouldn't see that they're on the edge of the cliff, and would fall down and get seriously hurt, or maybe even die. And so that those were stories that were in there. And there were a lot of stories about people trying to trick the devil, and the use of holy water and different things like that to sort of work against the devil and whatever ancient spirits. And there was the story of Madame Corriveau, which was historic, that when the English came and they had won against the French and they were instituting English law, whenever there was severe punishment, they had an iron cage, and they would put the person in the iron cage, no food, no water, just suspend the iron cage. Their legs would be out, their arms would be out, and they would just be sitting there till the body rotted. And it was warning to anybody going by that this is what happens. We find you guilty, we put you in this cage, and then they usually had a guard there to make sure that nobody assisted, nobody gave any water, any assistance whatsoever. And apparently this Iron Maiden cage was a traditional British way of punishing people. And there are a number of stories of the French who have, the horror of what that's like to die there and have, or to have the, being bitten and stung and eaten by birds and insects. It was quite horrible. But apparently there was a case of a woman called Madame Corriveau. I can't remember the details. I think she was accused of killing her husband, and she said no, it was all sort of like a misunderstanding. It was an accident, it wasn't murder, it wasn't anything like that. But the English courts tried her and accused her and said, this is it, you're going into the Iron Maiden. So they put her up, and there's St. Lawrence River flows towards the east, so there's the north shore and the south shore, but on the north shore particularly, the roads are very hilly, up and down. And back in the time of Madame Corriveau, the roads were basically cart trails. People would have their horses or their donkeys or something pulling the carts up and down to get from village to village, which is usually quite widespread. And Madame Corriveau was on top of one of these hills, very close to Ile d'Orléans, which is a huge island in the St. Lawrence River. Put up in a place where anybody going between the villages of that area could see her from below or could walk it. They would have to pass by her cage. So one of the legends, because there's several, but one of the legends was this gentleman was going to visit a friend, and it was during the day, and his friend was taking him over, taking him over by the cart and was showing him around. He says, "Oh yeah, this is Madame Corriveau," and they're talking about how wicked and terrible this kind of punishment was, and that they couldn't even take down the skeleton that was just sort of jingling there in the wind. And then nobody travels at night along here because they said, well, then let's go to your place, we'll eat a meal and whatever and come. Well, it got kind of late, and the friend insisted, well, you got to stay. And so the guy says, no. He says, I'm a businessman, I got to get back to the city. I have to go there. And he says, well, you're going to have to go by Madame Corriveau. And it was some sacred evening, some special evening. I forget what it was. Something like just the night before Halloween, like something similar to that they had. And the guy says, no, I'll go. And then he went up there, and he was going up. Then he came to the spot where in the moonlight there was this thing rattling. And he said, this is really horrible. And he says, I'm not a man who believes that much in this sort of thing. But he says, I'm going to get out of my cart and I'm going to pray for her soul. So we got out of his cart and he knelt down there and he started to pray. And then all of a sudden he felt this pressure on his shoulder. He looked over and there's skeletal fingers. And it was, he said it was this thing from the cage. The cage had come down from the cage. And I can't remember if it was in the cage still or not, but it had grasped him, and it says, you've got to take me down to the river, and you have to take me by boat to Ile d'Orléans, because on this night, all the spirits of the damned, and I've been damned by these English, the spirits of the damned were free for that night. You got to take me down. And he said he looked over to the island d'Orléans, and he said he saw almost like northern lights just sort of whooshing and wishing across a thing. And then it just terrified him. He said suddenly he became very scared. And he tried to get away and was grabbing at these arms and trying to pull. And these forms just sort of flared, and we're looking at him, we're yelling at him, bring her across, bring her across, bring her across. And then he just sort of fell down. He woke up in the morning, though at first, because his body was so cold, lying in the dew and the wet. He thought, am I dead? Have I damned myself? Has the damned damned me? Then he could feel some sunlight, and he thought, well, hell doesn't have sunlight. So he opened his eyes and he looked around and he realized, oh, there's my horse, there's my cart, and there's Madame Corriveau up in the cage, and there's Ile d'Orléans, and everything looks normal. And he says, wow, what a nightmare I had. And then he felt up on his neck, and his neck was really sore. He thought he could feel fingerprints across his neck. So he got into the cart, and then he rode down to the city, and everybody asked him, why are you looking so crazy, and what happened? And he says, I was attacked by Madame Corriveau in the night. And he told the story. So that's a legend that's actually passed around in the area, and that they tell in that area, the legends of Madame Corriveau. But like I said, that's just one of them. There's a number, and whether that's just a mechanism for telling the stories or to keep people in line, or where that comes from. But the French Canadians have tremendous traditions. The stories of the devil. If you say the right words and call the devil will pick up your canoe and it'll transport your canoe. And as long as you don't touch a church steeple, or as long as you don't say, I think it's a blessing or something like this, I forget. But then there's lots of stories of those too. It's very rich. So if you ever get a chance, if you want to read some interesting stories, look up the sort of the folkloric legends of how people outsmarted the devil, and other stories of loup-garou, and because it's certainly very rich in those areas. To sort of leave that and kind of get back to strange stories, sort of that ilk. We were sitting around a group of us younger people were sitting around and we're chit-chatting, and there was a woman at 30. She seemed kind of old to us because we were, just teenagers. She was listening to our stories, and she was just nodding, and she said, yeah. She says, but you know what? I've got a true story. Okay, what's your true story? Well, she said, I'm from England, and we could tell by her accent. And she said, I was engaged to be married. So my girlfriends came over and said, well, we got to do something really crazy. It's your last night as a free woman. What do you want to do? And the girls were throwing in around their ideas, and they said, at the top of the hill, there's this old house, and it's supposed to be abandoned because it's supposed to be haunted. Let's go spend the night there. That should be something crazy, something really memorable. And so they packed themselves up, and they got all their sleeping gear, and one of the girls had a dog, and they were walking the dog up, and they're going up the hill, and they got to this place, and this woman telling the story says, well, it certainly looked the part of a spooky mansion. She said it was all dark, and just the windows and everything, and the sort of the wind whooshing and wailing through the trees and all the rest of it. She said they were just about to go through the gate when the dog suddenly stopped and looked, and the hair on the dog was just all up, and the dog started to bark and to growl and started to circle. And these women are watching the dog, and it's as if there's something standing just behind the entry gate that they can't see, they can't hear. But obviously the dog is just going crazy, and it's barking and going and carry on. It happens that this woman's fiance was looking for her and heard, wow, they're probably gone up, We heard the girls talking, they'd go check up there. So we went up there, and he saw the dog. And then there was a big discussion because his fiance was saying, yeah, well, me and the girls were going to go in there anyways. And he said, look at that dog. Are you crazy? You're not going in there. And finally, he just managed to pull her away, and that was that. And then she never did. And so we're sort of all looking at her. We're saying, well, aren't you glad you couldn't go in there? And she said, well, yes and no. I think it would have been a very interesting night me and my girlfriends would have had. But now, I'll never know, because he won't let me go near the place. So, yeah, that was kind of a story. But I think in terms of the stories, that's probably the better ones that I have, I think. There's other ones, but there's probably a better one.